This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 315. Changing the role of central banks.
Yeah, I know there are difficult forecasts out there, but forecasts are not destiny. And what we shouldn't be doing is talking ourselves into a recession.
I'm worried that Liz Truss's plans will make the situation worse. And what I want to do is different.
But it's notable that 80% of the overshoot over the target at that point is due to energy and tradable goods.
No, interest rates should have been raised a long time ago, and the Bank of England has been too slow.
And now inflation is hitting double digits. So clearly something's gone wrong.
You know what? This something-for-nothing economics isn't conservative, it's socialism.
Under your plans, we are predicted to have a recession.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Well, the new British Prime Minister has vowed to review the mandate of the Bank of England, but it seems what she's thinking is that they should have just moved quicker on raising interest rates to curb inflation, as though it goes without saying that that's going to work. But what if it doesn't? And what exactly is the role of the Bank of England anyway, or any other central bank for that matter? And was it a sensible decision to make them independent of government? Aren't they sometimes working against each other? Wouldn't Liz Truss be working against the Bank of England if she pushes ahead with tax cuts that add to the aggregate demand, which could escalate inflation? What is it with central banks? That's this week on the Debunking Economics Podcast. So, Steve, the new British Prime Minister announced today, Monday, as we're doing this, is Liz Truss. She has vowed to review the mandate of the Bank of England. So, given that she's going to do that, maybe we can help her. So, Steve, I thought this week we could have a look and see what should be the role of central banks. I mean, I think there's two things that central banks supposedly do. They try and maintain some sort of control over the value of money, so it doesn't lose value too rapidly through inflation. Not doing very well at that at the moment, are they? And then also, they make sure the banking system doesn't collapse like they failed to do in 2008. So on both of those counts, central banks aren't very good at what they do. Maybe we should start with, stopping banking collapses and what went wrong in 2008. I mean, that really was a response to deregulation, wasn't it? With banks undertaking risky practices. In particular, they were packaging up all those risky mortgages into securities which were sold on the sly. And then when those mortgages failed, basically the world economy collapsed. I mean, can central banks stop that? Is it going to happen again? Are they any good at that side of their supposed mandate?
Well, they're not. And the trouble was, it's everything leads back to the danger of letting neoclassical economists run anything apart from maybe a milk run. Their decision-making, their beliefs about how the economy operates led to them believing that you could get rid of risk by diversifying it. Now, this is crazy because an individual can diversify themselves away from risk, but a society can't. And this is what Keynes said so brilliantly back in 1937 when he was, I think, a paper called The General Theory of Employment, which I recommend anybody who thinks they know what Keynes is about and therefore anti-Keynesian because of it, read the 1937 paper, The General Theory of Employment, and also another one called Alternative Theories of the Rate of Interest. You'll think you're reading Hayek. Okay, just let the Austrians out there know that they're interested. Oh, this must be Hayek. No, sorry, it's Keynes. Now, part of what he said was that an individual can diversify their financial risk quite easily by taking a range of different shares, a range of assets, and so on and so forth. But an individual farmer can't decide to grow barley in the morning and wheat in the afternoon, given a change in spot prices for the two. They're committed. They've made a physical commitment. And equally, when you get to the overall social level, if there's a risk of something happening, the fact that you can sell that risk in a fractional way throughout the society doesn't change the fact that it's going to hit the aggregate of society.
Yeah,
it's still there, so you can't get rid of it. But because the usual story of mistaking the micro for the macro, which really is the foundation of neoclassical economics, projecting what an individual can do and believing the whole society can do the same thing, which is the total fallacy of composition, again something that Keynes hammered on back in the 1930s. But because that is a fallacy of composition, you can't get out of the way. The risk is still there. The danger will still be borne. And of course, when it did, those things, rather than being ways to reduce risk, became ways to amplify risk. Now, I think the central bank will learn that particular lesson. We don't have quite a level of junk bonds we had back then, and we still have mortgage-backed securities, but nothing like the tranching that was done back in those days. So they've learnt by experience. They're not going to redo that mistake, but they're still believing they can run the economy like it's a neoclassical whiteboard, and it's not. So putting up interest rates on the whiteboard reduces demand through what they call the Taylor equation, relating the rate of inflation to the level of effective capacity of the economy, and therefore the rate of interest, rate of inflation, and capacity of the economy. Those are the three variables to go into the Taylor equation from memory. Because they can do it on the whiteboard, they can do it in the real world, and it's going to fail completely. It's going to actually probably cause inflation to rise because you're increasing the cost of business in a very, as we were saying last week, a very dangerous environment.
Well, I mean, their answer on that, that because it was speculation, wasn't it? That really was the problem in 2008. So, I mean, that's
speculation and too much private debt. Those two. Let's not forget, private debt was essential. That's the reason that I could call the crisis before it happened. I wasn't calling on the basis of saying these mortgage-backed securities and tranches are madness, though they were. I was talking about that, but it wasn't my main focus. The main focus was the rate of growth of debt is positive, therefore credit demand is positive and adding to aggregate demand. Debt levels are so high that at some point people are going to be unwilling to borrow more money and banks aren't willing to lend. The rate of growth of debt will stop, credit will turn negative, and that will cause the crisis, which is precisely what happened. Now, we're not seeing the same potential for that this time round, because even though there's been an increase in the level of private debt during the pandemic and now during the early days of this energy crisis, it's not to the same scale of credit as it was before the 2008 crash. So you're not jumping off quite as high a cliff when it comes down, but it will turn negative. And that's, again, they haven't learned that lesson. They don't appreciate the impact of negative credit on aggregate demands.
Yeah, and
they're going to cause negative credit.
Yeah, you're never going to get them to agree to that either, are you? I mean, because a bank would say, more debt's a good thing because that means more people are borrowing to put more money into the economy. It's a sign of the health of the economy to have high levels of private debt. That's
the way they think. Yeah, they're still thinking it. I mean, the Bank of International Settlements is still a source of relative wisdom on this front, as I hope are still I haven't seen them for a long, long time, but some of my friends in the research division of the Bank of England who are aware of the endogenous nature of money creation. They must be watching the Monetary Policy Committee and holding their, going out to get drunk afterwards at each of the meetings, because they're seeing them following textbook economics that these people inside the Bank Research Department know is wrong.
So we had the Dodd-Frank Act in the United States. That was one response to 2008. And that had, including the one aspect of it was the Volcker rule, which basically, as I understand it, it meant banks had to act on behalf of clients. Wow, imagine that! And they couldn't make speculative. It couldn't make speculative investments with their own money. But actually, you'd want that, wouldn't you? Isn't that actually a good thing? That if banks, I mean, if a bank makes a speculative investment, I mean, it's taking a risk, but isn't that what banks are for? So you have, I mean, if you take money out of their own equity, for example, and use that to invest in growing the economy, that's a good thing, isn't it?
Well, they don't do it, and they can't do it. Banks have got strict limitations on the sort of assets they can buy, which is why the shadow banking system has evolved. Most of the shadow banks themselves ultimately owned by banks, so it's a way of the banks getting around the regulations, controlling their capacity to speculate. But again, back to Keynes, when the management of the economy becomes the byproduct of the activities of the casino, the job is likely to be ill done. It's being ill done, and the last thing we need is these people that Marx once called the roving cavaliers of credit. We don't want them running the economy anymore. We've seen what happens. We had a financial crisis, courtesy of handing over running the economy to the financial sector in the aftermath of the 80s. So by 2008, that's crashed apart. Now we don't want the same buggers in control when we're running into ecological crisis, as well as the supply crises we're seeing from COVID and so on. So yeah, we've got to tame the financial sector, and that means taming the central banks as well.
Yeah, but how do you do that then? So after the Great Depression, one of the suggestions was it came from the University of Chicago that banks should be forced to retain 100% of their deposits. So it would be impossible for them to create money or destroy money. Actually, Irving Fisher was someone who was supposedly behind this idea, which was called narrow banking, I think was the term it was used. So in other words, banks would just be, they'd just hold your deposits, basically, wouldn't they? And they wouldn't have any scope for lending beyond what they're holding in reserves.
Yeah, this is part of a positive money policies there as well, to stop banks being money creators and make them money allocators, so that the government would put give them a certain amount of money into a account for each bank out of which they could lend, but when the account was depleted they couldn't lend anymore. So there would be money creation, but money creation directed by the government, a distribution of that money through bank lending. But that then means, of course, they need to be accurate in getting arbitrage. They've got to be able to get that money at effectively no cost, but then make a profit on the allocation. And I'd actually, my gut feeling is they won't be able to. A huge part of the profitability of banking comes out of the capacity to create money. If you take that away, not only does it have to be, the financial sector has to be far smaller than it is right now, it's quite possible there wouldn't be a profit in it.
But is that the root of the problem, though? The ability for banks to create money? Because that's and central banks like to think that they control that they are the.
Which of course they don't. Yeah, yeah, they'll let it go totally crazy, but they don't control it. But when you think about the financial sector's fundamental role is to enable us to buy and sell goods and services off each other. Its role is, again, a bit like the share market. People see the share market as a place that creates capital. When you take a look at the aggregate level, there's more share market money value destruction going on through buybacks and things of that nature than there is creation of new money. The actual IPO market, the actual raising of funds by share issue, initial share issues, is trivial compared to the volume that goes into speculating about the value of second-hand shares, where the money never goes anywhere near the company whose shares are being traded. It's all speculation and gambling. So do we lose much if we lose that? No. That'd be a great thing to lose. You want a bit of price discovery, and I talk about this in one of my ideas for the modern debt jubilee, included the idea of jubilee shares, where the focus would be on minimising the second-hand trade side of the share market and maximising the raising revenue for new ventures side of the share market. So companies would issue shares. They could be traded a certain number of times. That's where your price discovery thing comes in. But then after, let's say, a dozen or 2 dozen trades, those shares would become Jubilee shares, which would expire after 50 years. The only reason to buy them was because you're getting a dividend flow out of them. And that's the rationale that's currently used to justify in pension funds and so on buying shares on the market, because they're getting a dividend flow. Well, garbage. They're mainly gambling about the price of the share. But if you know the ultimate price of that share is going to be zero after 50 years, all you're going to buy it for is the dividend stream, and you will actually do what the textbooks claim you do already now, and that's to make some rational estimate of future revenue and then buy shares to get the revenue stream until they expire.
Right. So how does this relate to what we're talking about today, though? Which is by the way, anyone who's tuning in for the first time, because we've got some new listeners now who made this podcast available for free. Yeah. And sometimes Steve will just blow your mind and go for a moment or two, I haven't got a clue what he's talking about, but stick with us because a lot of these themes do recur. So we will look at the idea of Jubilee shares again in a future episode. We've done it once or twice before. But how for all of this idea, reducing the risk element and the speculation, how does, through, for example, Jubilee shares, how does that relate back to the role of central banks?
Well, they're really saying the central banks believe they could leave regulation to the regulator, and often they fobbed off the regulation. Like in Australia, they fobbed it off to what they called APRA, Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, which would have been a total disaster. A similar thing in the UK, it's gone to, there's a Financial Stability Board, isn't there? That's separate to the Bank of England.
And the Financial Conduct Authority as well, the FCA.
Conduct, okay. So they've said we can farm this stuff out. We don't need it. We can just manipulate everything using the interest rate, and by putting interest rate up twice as fast as the change in the rate of inflation, we can control inflation and get the economy to the natural, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which is a load of Milton Friedman bollocks. Yet again, it's this fairy, this will-o'-the-wisp that economists spend their days trying to measure and create, and it just basically tends to be a lagged convergence to the current unemployment rate. It's got nothing to do with reality.
Yeah.
But to get them to believe they cannot control the economy that way, get them to learn some Minsky fundamentally and say, what is your role? Fundamentally, your role is to guarantee the safety and security of the payment system. That's what you should be doing. And as part of that, you should be limiting what banks do in terms of gambling with financial assets rather than encouraging, which is what you've been doing for the last 40 years, ever since bloody Modigliani and Miller wrote called the Modigliani-Miller the hypothesis, would argue that the level of debt that a company takes out doesn't matter. That was the beginning of ignoring the incredible explosion in private debt that got us into the financial crisis back in 2008 in the first place.
And I guess
so again,
as long as we have this idea that central banks, I mean, the idea that central banks will control the banking system and ensure that it doesn't fall over, that has tended to be interpreted as, rather than, oh, well, we're going to regulate you to make sure that you behave so you don't fall over. It's really been interpreted as, well, look, if you do fall over, what we'll do is we'll pump a whole load of money in and save the day. So that obviously then means, that the perception that banks are going to be too big to fail. If they do fail, central banks are there, they'll get bailed out. And obviously that just enhances the appetite for risk.
And that's exactly what happened. It was first called the Greenspan put when it happened back in the 87 stock market crash, when the market fell 20% in one day. And Greenspan was just taken over running the central bank at that stage, the Fed, and basically said, effectively like a Mario Draghi statement today, whatever it takes, we won't let these companies fail. And it became known as the Greenspan put. So all the risk was taken, not all the risk, but a lot of it was taken out because you knew if you got into financial difficulty, the Fed would bail you out. And then, of course, now the Fed's become a buyer of last resort through quantitative easing. So all these things have massively distorted the asset market, and it's all allowed this huge increase in private debt, which is what caused the crisis in the first place. So that's why the first thing I'd have the central bank doing, it can't do it directly. It has to work through the Treasury to do the modern debt jubilee. But they've got to regard, at the moment they regard the inflation rate and the unemployment rate and this crazy idea of Nehru, which has talked about the capacity of the economy. Those are the three main factors they put into their macro models. Chuck out those macro models, learn Minsky, learn dynamic economics rather than the crap they do at the moment. But add private debt as a target and add credit as a target, and want to get private debt down to 1/3 what it is now, get it back to the level it was back in the 1950s and 60s, rather than in America's case 170% of GDP, get it back to 60%, 50% of GDP, and
right.
Then try to maintain those. Start thinking like a Minsky and stop thinking like a neoclassical.
So you're saying that should be a central bank target. So you'd be happy to see the continued maintenance of this independence of central banks, would you? But one of the targets should be the level of debt, the level of private debt which is being held.
Well, it's more so, not so much the independence. The independence is mythical anyway because they're owned by the Treasury. And only profits they make are remitted to the Treasury. But the main thing is they have to see themselves as an integrated part of the government. And again, it's just, we've got an economic theory which is ignorant of the actual structure of the economy, being the way in which economists try to manage the economy through institutions like the central bank and the Treasury. Now, just got to get rid of them. I mean, this neoclassical mindset is deadly on every possible front, especially when ironically, the thing they most think they're experts about, the monetary system or the economic system, their model of it is wrong. And therefore, what they do as policy controls is wrong as well. We simply have to get rid of that thinking. This is what Bill White was trying to do, by the way, when he was research director for the Bank of International Settlements. And the Bank of International Settlements under Bill was the only formal body to warn of the financial crisis before it happened. Now, of course, Bill, and I'm speaking to him personally, he's become a good friend since the crisis. Bill actually had to stare down Alan Greenspan in meetings over this stuff, where he was saying that the financial crisis is likely to come, we've got to change direction. And Greenspan basically dared the other bankers to default to basically cowed them into not listening to Bill's directions. And bang, we got the financial crisis 2 years later.
So it's interesting, isn't it, how the bond markets actually give us a lot of indications about how investors think the future of the economy is going to be. So they are, for example, short-term, short maturity bond yields are going up because everyone's looking and thinking, oh my God, the Fed are going to keep on pushing interest rates. then 5 years, they're well down. In fact, even in a couple of years, if you look at what they're expecting, the market is expecting, yes, they're going to push up interest rates a lot this year, and then they're going to pull them right back next year. And then you've got, so the Fed, of course, who can't be out of kilter with where the market is, are busy saying, no, don't assume that it's going to be over next year. This is going to take years to fix. So in other words, they're saying to the market, you're expecting the yields to be much lower, or your yields are well below where they should be. So, so push them up. But the truth is, I wonder how many of those investors are thinking, which I think is your line of thinking, mine too, that they are going to push interest rates up. It's not going to work. And next year they're going, we got all that wrong. The economy's tanked. We better pull those interest rates right down. We've achieved nothing, but we've got to reverse our position. And
that's what I expect to happen too, because again, coming back to the level of private debt. Again, if you have a Minskian attitude to private debt, it's too high. That putting interest rates will cause credit to go from positive to negative. And this is something I proved mathematically back in 2018. I think it's in my book, The New Economics of Manifesto. Credit is part of aggregate demand and income. Now, that is not something mainstream economists are aware of. If you read Ben Bernanke, for example, and I don't recommend it, but I'll save you the pain. I've read him myself. He said at one point that the reason that that Irving Fisher's debt deflation theory of Great Depressions was rejected was the counter argument that debt deflation represents no more than a redistribution from one group debtors to another group creditors. Now, for a start, that's lunacy, because a debt deflation means people don't pay their debts, so the creditors don't get anything. It's stupid, even at that level. But what he's saying, it's pure redistribution is what they see lending as. So they think when a loan is repaid, they don't see the role of credit. They're getting a bit long-winded there. But I've proven that credit is part of aggregate demand and aggregate income. So if credit
you don't even need to prove it. So there isn't a bank. So it's like saying that's saying when a bank gives out a loan, that is not creating new money, isn't it?
That's what they're saying. Well, they're not creating new money and not creating new demand.
Right, but Bank of England in black and white says no, that's not what happens. They acknowledge that when banks give a loan, that's new money into the economy.
The Bank of England, so did the Bundesbank, so did the Norwegian Central Bank, even the Australian one of the few decent people in the Australian Central Bank made a similar comment. So that it's becoming slowly seeping into the minds of the neoclassical economists that they're wrong on that front. They've got to acknowledge that banks create money when they lend, but they still haven't tied that up with aggregate demand. They still don't realise that. So the point I'm making is when they're putting up interest rates, they think they're attenuating the demand for money by making investment projects less net present value positive, and therefore reducing investment and slowing the economy in a gradual way. What they're not seeing is they're going to turn credit from positive, so debt growing, private debt growing, to negative. And when it does, there will be a fall in demand, not as severe as in 2008, but the same basic story. If you look back at 2008, credit demand in America went from 15% of GDP in 2006 to minus 5% in 2009. So you had a 20% of GDP turnaround in aggregate demand coming out of the credit going from positive to negative. It won't be quite that severe this time, but it will still be of the order 5 to 10%. Now, when that hits, that's not what the banks are expecting at all. They will get a shock. They will think, oh my God, the economy's slowed down far more than we thought it would. We've got a reverse direction. And they'll have to put up, I think, for a long time with effectively negative real interest rates.
Right. Well, this is the Debunking Economics podcast. You'll know that because you chose to listen and you're 23 minutes into it. We are back again in just a second with more. Now, Steve, the reason why we're looking at the role of central banks this week is because Liz Truss has said that she wants a review in the UK of the role of central banks. She's talking more, I think, about the independence, and she's just saying it, I think, just for popular appeal, because central banks are taking a hammering for the opposite of what you've just been saying. That a lot of people saying, oh, they didn't move fast enough. That's why inflation is getting out of control. And therefore we need to see that they don't delay pushing up interest rates. In other words, we need to ensure that they don't do the wrong thing more quickly next time. But the other side of it as well is, and this whole independence thing, central banks over the last few years bailed out the government, in effect, didn't they? I don't know whether that's the right terminology, bailing out, but, they have been buying up government debt, if we want to call it that. £450 billion worth of government and corporate bonds were bought by the Bank of England in 2020 and 2021. Most of it was actually government bonds. So is that an essential function of central banks? And should they do that independently? It's not happening independently, is it? I mean, basically, the government is issuing that money. They're talking to the central bank and saying, look, we need to get out of this crisis we're in. We need you to buy up a heap of bonds.
Again, this is not understanding the dynamics of money creation, because when the central bank buys bonds off private banks, that doesn't change the money supply at all. What it actually does, it actually reduces the money supply, because when the central bank, when the government sells bonds, let's go through it step by step. When the government runs a deficit, it creates money in people's private bank accounts, and it creates funds in the reserve accounts of private banks. They then use those funds to buy the bonds when the government issues bonds, which therefore it's
let's go. Okay, we'll do this. Let's go through. This is important. Let's go through this step by step. So let me paraphrase, and you tell me where I've got it wrong. So the government says, right, we're going to create £1 billion. That money has to be spent, so it ends up in people's bank accounts. So the £1 billion ends up spread out around a whole load of banks. Those banks receive that money, so that money goes into the reserves it goes into people's bank accounts, but it's also sitting there. The actual physical cash is sitting in the reserves of those banks. To pay for that, the government says, right, okay, well, we need to issue bonds. So they issue the £1 billion.
No, the government is actually trying to make sure its account at the central bank doesn't go negative. That's why it sells bonds. Right. Okay, so it sells those bonds. So the £1 billion
pounds of bonds.
£1 billion pounds goes into people's bank accounts. £1 billion goes into the funds of the reserve accounts of the private banks at the central bank. The Treasury then issues bonds with a face value of £1 billion and sells them to the private banks, and the funds they use to buy those bonds have been created by the deficit and are sitting in the reserve accounts.
Yeah, it's that £1 billion is sitting in reserves. And so the bank says, well, we might as well buy those bonds now because
so
they're going to give us a return.
They do the swap, yeah. Now, that does nothing to the money supply.
Yeah.
Okay, it's all okay. But what then happens is, then the government starts paying interest on those bonds. Now, the interest, let's say the interest is 3%. So you got £1 billion being created. That's 30 million. We're talking small numbers here. The actual numbers are closer to trillions than billions. But let's just stick with the numerical example you started with. So £1 billion of bonds of deficit is created. £1 billion of reserves are created. They are converted into £1 billion worth of bonds. Let's say the bonds earn 3% interest. Then the banks get a steady stream of £30 million per year interest income. Now, if the central bank comes in and buys all those bonds, which it can do as well, then that interest income falls to zero. So you have £30 billion less money being created, money which is being created in the financial sector rather than the real economy by the interest, but that disappears. So central bank bond buying, which people think is part of creating money, actually ends up with less money being created because you end the creation of money through paying interest on government bonds.
Right.
Where it does turn up, it gets more complicated. Where it does turn up is because banks themselves then sell those bonds to non-bank, the public, mainly non-bank financial institutions, so the hedge fund part of the world, hedge funds, pension funds, and stuff like that. So when they do that, that means that actually reduces the money supply because when the banks sell those bonds, they reduce their own holding of bonds. But they get transferred to being owned by the non-bank financial institutions. But the deposits of the NBFIs fall, and therefore the money supply falls. That's a fall that occurs in the financial sector.
Yeah, because those non-bank institutions are using it. They're buying those bonds instead of buying something else that's already out there.
But what then happens is when the central bank practices quantitative easing and buys those bonds back off the non-bank financial institution, that does create money.
Right. Okay.
But that creates money just in the financial sector.
So so that's good, and I think hopefully most people have been with us on most of that. And if not, go back and you'll find we've discussed this several times on the podcast. And it takes getting your head around it can take a bit of time. But the basic question if central banks are in effect bailing out the government, buying those buying those bonds.
Well, then they're not bailing out the government. Okay.
Well,
if they buy the bond, the QE was a policy that was supposed to stimulate the economy. Well, look how successful it was.
Yeah.
Okay, we had the slowest recovery ever since slowest recovery in the history of economic recoveries after the 2008
So, okay,
crisis.
there's a simpler question then. Should they engage in QE at all? Or should it be something that's just banned?
The only role for QE was where it was necessary to give to buy bonds off institutions which couldn't sell bonds otherwise and were going to go bankrupt. Okay, so it comes back to the role that they should be involved in is the budget rule, that they try to maintain the solvency of the financial system. But they should have, when they did that, they should have taken stakes in those companies as well. And of course, this is what was not done by the central bank. So this is, again, thinking in a neoclassical way gets in the way. If they'd actually thought in a Minskian way or a budget way, they should have taken an equity position in those firms when they bailed them out by buying their bonds. And of course, that is a complete change in the mindset that I can't see happening to the Bank of England's, certainly not the Monetary Policy Committee. Maybe some of the research staff would be willing to contemplate what I'm talking about, but not the MPC.
So what have we changed so far then? We've said that they can't engage in QE. Do we like the idea that they should? How are they controlling the stability of banks? What are we changing? Just so Liz Truss can keep up, because I'm sure she's listening and she wants to know how she needs to reform the Bank of England. So no more QE is one. What were we doing to control the stability of banks?
Well, that is where you do buy assets on occasions to rescue them when they're going to fold. You don't want the payment system to break down. So you still want them doing the bond purchasing for the budget types reasons rather than for neoclassical quantitative easing theory type reasons. So you want that to happen. You want them to be monitoring they're really focusing on the financial fragility of the economy. You don't want banks with too much private debt because you then get financial fragility for the entire economy, and you don't want them overindulging in speculation because that also gives you financial fragility.
So that was your other suggestion. Actually, one of their targets should be the amount of private debt which is held in the country. That should be one of their focuses. So what about how on the independence question, the way that central banks and governments often don't? I mean, sometimes they clearly work together, but other times they don't. So if the government stoked inflation, like for example, if right now if they cut taxes because they think that we need to get the economy going again, and we're going to drive up the demand for goods by giving people more money in their pockets, so we're going to cut taxes so they've got more money to spend, and then of course that just pushes up demand for products which don't exist. Therefore, it pushes prices higher, so we get more inflation. Then the central bank comes and says, "Oh, well, the only way we know to cope with inflation is to push up interest rates." So that pushes up everyone's mortgage, so they have even less. You've actually got the government making things worse, and the central bank just adding to that. Is independence they're operating at odds with each other? Is independence actually a good thing when you have that sort of thing happening, or is it just plain stupid?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, this is again modern monetary theory's focus on the central bank as part of the government, and I think they exaggerate part of the analysis, but the fundamental story is the central bank is the conduit through which the Treasury operates on the private sector economy. And that's its main role as a conduit. It's not a control mechanism. And trying to make it into a control mechanism when they ignore what the main factors were led to the 2008 crisis. And we don't want a repeat of that, nor do we want them to be putting up interest rates now and sucking demand out of an economy which is going to suffer with demand being sucked out of it by high energy prices as well. So the energy sector is going to do very nicely, but not the rest of the economy. So the central bank focusing on interest rate increases is going to add to the bankruptcies of the private sector, which is the last thing a private sector needs right now.
And yet, sadly, because of course when a government says it's going to undertake a review, it's already decided what the outcome of that review is going to be, obviously, even if it's the wrong outcome. So when Liz Truss says she wants a review of the Bank of England accountability, and Australia, by the way, is launching a review of the RBA as well, in both cases, I think it's really the government wants to put the blame on rising inflation on the central banks and take the blame away from the government. Obviously had nothing whatsoever to do with
this was a major reason why central bank independence was something that politicians were quite willing to contemplate, because we go back to the 1970s with interest rates. Somebody else can take the blame. And Paul Keating was quite happy to hand that hot potato over to the central bank. And the same thing applying in the UK as well. So, but the thing is, if they knew what they were doing, that would have been a good idea. They clearly don't know what they're doing because they follow neoclassical economics. Yeah, and it's certainly, this smells of for a review for the wrong reason, which is to say, well, inflation's rising because central banks didn't push up interest rates fast enough. That seems to be what, which is, as you're saying, is exactly the wrong thing. It would be a bit sad, wouldn't it, if they did this review. I mean, it would show a government that was incompetent. Imagine that. If they did this review... can't have that, no. The review comes back and says, well, actually, do you know what? They didn't push up interest rates fast enough. That's why we've got inflation. About the same time that actually it's realised that, no, it's making no difference whatsoever, and they're going to have to bring those interest rates down. That would make the review look a bit stupid, wouldn't it? But I wonder whether... of course that can't happen. The review's got to be sensible. Yeah, that's going to be fun to read. I mean, I haven't actually bothered putting in this submission into the Australian one, though obviously I could, because I just think it's going to get swallowed. I mean, I wrote a submission to the Harries Committee back in the 90s warning about the dangers of financial deregulation. Look how much advice was taken of that. Yeah. Harries did actually, I forgot, I think Professor Harries actually did thank me for a stimulating presentation, but that's all it got. And the guy on the central bank rep on the Harries Committee in Australia was gleeful in trying to overwhelm my arguments by throwing neoclassical textbook stuff at me. So I think his last name was Farmer. Sometime later, he's wearing a fair bit of mud on his face, which has been fun to watch. You used to be a journalist years ago, didn't you? You've still got it. You're writing headlines as you talk. So the Attorney General in the UK is Suella Braverman, a big supporter of Liz Truss. She said that the review is going to look at the extent to which the Bank of England could retain its independent decision making on interest rates. So in other words, she thinks the government should have a say on interest rates as well. I'm not sure that's going to make the situation worse or better, or just makes no change whatsoever. But she's pointing to the Bank of Japan as a central bank that works well. Is that the case? I'm not sure 2 decades of deflation is necessarily a sign that a central bank is doing its job well. And she questions whether the Bank of England, it is a better model. Because it has, I mean, the argument is it has less accountability. Because there is a bit of a hybrid model working there, isn't there? But is the Bank of Japan one to look at? I don't particularly think so. What they look at is there's a scale of government debt in Japan, which is 250% plus of GDP, and nobody's declared bankruptcy in Japan, or the central bank or the government. So that's the scale that government debt can get to without stimulating the economy. That's the lesson to learn, that government debt is not a problem. Private debt is the problem. That's worth learning. But apart from that, I wouldn't be going too much checking out the notes of the Japanese Monetary Policy Committee. Right. Do you know what, though? I suspect that this review will, because they've identified Japan, they'll look at the Bank of Japan, and that the size of government debt issuance, I think, will probably be ignored in the whole review. Be lucky if it gets a paragraph. For sure. Yeah. Heaven help us if we don't want to learn from reality. No, of course not. All right, very good. So, in a nutshell, I like the idea that one of the functions of the central bank should be in ensuring that private debt doesn't get up to a set level. That's perhaps a more meaningful measure than interest rates, and it should be brought under control of government. It shouldn't be there sitting as an independent authority. Seems to be what you're saying as well, because he's not independent anyway. Basically, no, that's true. And the wrong people are running it. That's the main problem. Sorted. There we are, Liz. Get some post-Keynesian economists inside there. You can have a review for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. We've just done it for you in half an hour. Good to talk, Steve. Catch you again soon. Okay, mate. Bye-bye. And that's it for this week. That's the Debunking Economics podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. We'll be back again next week. Tell your friends about it so they can come and join the party, because, the more the merrier, basically. We'll catch you again next week. Thanks for listening.
The Debunking Economics podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.